Hi, I'm Rachel Chattelbash. I'm the Director of Public Engagement at the Yale Center for British Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the opening lecture for our exhibition, JMW Turn, Romance and Reality, which is on view on our third floor through August 10th. The exhibition couldn't have arrived at a more perfect moment. The year 2025 marks the 250th anniversary of Turner's birth and the reopening of the museum after building conservation work. I'm delighted that we can once again share our collections with you, and especially thrilled that you'll have the opportunity to discover our exceptional Turner holdings. More than 2 centuries after his birth, Turner remains one of the most studied and acclaimed artists in British history. And in displaying JMW Turner, Romance and Reality, we invite you to join the critical conversation about Turner's legacy happening across 2025 and to consider what Turner's work means to you and your lives today. In a few moments, we'll hear about the show from Lucinda Lax, Curator of Paintings and Sculpture and Interim Head of the Curatorial Division at the YCBA. A specialist in 18th century British art, Lucinda came to the YCBA in 2023 from the National Galleries of Scotland, where she served as Senior Curator of Portraiture. In addition to curating the Turner Show, we're here to open, she oversaw the reinstallation of our paintings and sculpture collections on the 4th floor, which reimagines how we present the history of British art in our galleries. Before I invite Lucinda to the podium, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Yale undergraduate Annabelle Moore and former YCBA postdoctoral associate Annie Pilagura for their assistance on Romance and Reality. Thanks also to Jane Nowosatko, Head of Public Programs, for organizing this talk. Following the lecture, there'll be a question and answer session. If you're here in person, we ask that you please wait for a microphone before sharing your questions. So thank you, and please join me in welcoming Lucinda.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. I would also like to reiterate my thanks to my colleagues Annie Polagara and Annabelle Moore, whose assistance in the early stages of planning the exhibition proved so valuable. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Ian Worrell. I'm not sure if you're listening, Ian. Ian is the leading Turner expert and, of course, the author of our recent publication on the artist. And I'd like to thank Ian for his generous help with checking dates and titles of works in the show. So it's a particular pleasure to be here with you this evening and to be talking to you about one of the most celebrated of all British artists, Joseph my Lord William Turner. This is because today, in case you haven't yet spotted the enormous card, marks exactly 250 years since Turner's birth on April 23rd, 1775. This important anniversary year is one of the reasons why we wanted to cast a spotlight on Turner and to retell his story for our audiences. That we've been able to do so at the moment of our reopening after a 2-year closure to conserve our building, as well as alongside an exhibition of new work by much admired contemporary artist Tracy Emin, herself a lifelong admirer of Turner, couldn't be more fitting. But then we hardly needed the excuse of an anniversary or a major reopening to celebrate Turner's legacy, given the extraordinary power of his images to captivate viewers, a quality that has endured over 2 centuries and means that his work is just as fresh and relevant today as it was to his 19th century audiences. Through a career that spanned almost 6 decades, Turner succeeded in fundamentally reshaping the nature of artistic practice. Developing a uniquely personal vision, he not only embraced so-called modern subjects, but pioneered a stylistic approach that combined virtuoso brushwork with brilliant colour, dazzling light effects, and an almost abstract sensibility. The result was a form of landscape art that radically transformed the conventionalized tropes of traditional landscape painting into something that is almost overwhelming in its emotional expressiveness, painterly richness, and vivid evocation of the natural and artistic sublime. It was an approach to visualizing the world that represented an unprecedented and unparalleled break with the past. Turner, as a result, has often been described as the first truly modern artist, or as the forerunner of modern art. The qualities that have led to Turner's output to be regarded as so uncannily modern are abundantly reflected in the examples of his work held by the Yale Center for British Art. Staffa, Fingal's cave, is one of the most iconic. It shows the Hebridean island of Staffa off the west coast of Scotland, famed for its unique geology and associations with the ancient Gaelic hero Fingal. Turner had journeyed there in terrible weather conditions in 1832, and it's this personal experience that he dramatised so convincingly in his canvas. The painting contains all the ingredients that make Turner's work seem so fresh and different from that of most of his contemporaries. It not only brings together Turner's favourite subject of a dramatic natural landscape with a view of modern technology in the form of the steamboat that we see just to the right of the centre, it also epitomises Turner's highly innovative and experimental painterly technique. Thin glazes have been mixed with more heavily worked impasto to create a rich, varied surface that, in combination with the broad, impressionistic brushstrokes that punctuate the canvas, takes Turner's handling of forms towards the realm of abstraction. We see this taken even further in Invery Pier, important lake canvas, where Turner's remarkably free handling of his materials is apparent in the drips from the loosely applied washes that can be seen in the middle ground of the composition. But one of the purposes of this exhibition, and more to the point of this talk today, is to dig deeper into the nature of Turner's artistic achievement and his image as a pioneer of modernity. To do this, I will first talk a bit more about YCBA's extraordinary Turner collection, its origins and its special qualities. In the second part of my discussion, I'm going to talk through some of the works in the exhibition itself and what these tell us about Turner's life, personality and artistic career, and in particular to consider the tensions, complexities and contradictions they reveal. Then in the third and final part, I'll be analysing some specific works in detail. And in doing so, I hope to show that these complexities and contradictions are fundamental sources of Turner's artistic achievement. So to start with the collection itself, how did works as important as Staffa and Invery Pier that so powerfully exemplify Turner's groundbreaking innovation and ambition end up here at the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, Connecticut? We have, of course, Paul Mellon, our founder, to thank for this. Mellon was one of the greatest collectors and philanthropists of the 20th century. He made his first purchase of a work by a British artist, the highly appealing portrait of the champion racehorse Pumpkin by George Stubbs in 1936. He didn't, however, start collecting British art seriously until the 1950s. In some ways, it was a surprising choice. British art was poorly represented in museums at the time. It was also largely neglected by collectors who preferred more glamorous French and Italian Old Master, Impressionist, and modern works. In his autobiography, Reflections in a Silver Spoon, Mellon talks about a relatively subdued and down-at-heel British art market. But far from being put off, Mellon saw in this an opportunity. Its neglect meant that British art was relatively cheap to buy, a situation that was only amplified by the increasingly depressed state of the art market more generally following the Second World War. Capitalising on the unique market circumstances, he succeeded in acquiring a whole series of artworks that would later become recognised as the foremost examples of their kind, and therefore iconic masterpieces in the canon of British art. No less significantly, Mellon recognised that the circumstances of the 1950s to 1970s made it possible, probably for the last time ever, to put together a truly representative collection. One that captured all the main trends in the development of British art from the 16th century through to the second half of the 19th, as well as important groups of major later 19th and 20th century artists, such as Walter Sickert, Gwen John, and Ben Nicholson. It is precisely this comprehensiveness of vision that distinguishes YCBA's Turner collection. At its core is the series of major oil paintings that Mellon acquired over almost 2 decades. One of the first was Invery Pier, which he bought in December 1960. At the time, it was mistakenly thought to represent a view in northern Italy, an error that wasn't corrected for another 24 years. Over the following 3 years, Mellon added a further 6 paintings, including Harlech Castle, Newark Abbey, and Lake Avernus, all works that you see on the slide here. These were either bought at auction or directly from dealers who routinely handled works by important European masters. Mellon made his most significant purchase in 1966. This was his acquisition of Dort or Dordrecht, now one of YCBA's great masterpieces. It was first brought to Mellon's attention by John Walker, then director of the NGA in Washington. Walker had seen the painting at Farnley Hall in Yorkshire while visiting in the summer of 1963. It had been hanging there almost uninterruptedly for the previous 2 centuries, since it had been bought at the Royal Academy Exhibition of 1818 by Walter Fawkes, one of Turner's most important early supporters and patrons. And you can see the painting hanging in the drawing room at Farnley in the watercolour by Turner that's just to the right. You'd see it in the centre there. When Walker subsequently heard that Fawkes' descendants were considering selling it, he suggested that Mellon should approach them with an offer to purchase. The sale went through with the assistance of the eminent London art dealers Agnew and Sons. This was in spite of a misunderstanding over the sale price, which Mellon had taken to be in US dollars, but was in fact in British pounds, making it nearly 3 times as expensive as he'd thought. It's said that it took him some time to recover from the shock and to decide to go through with the deal. The episode didn't stop him going on to acquire a further set of major works by Turner. In 1967, he added the small but compelling early canvas A Lime Kiln to his holdings before purchasing 2 other significant oils, Bonville and Wreckers, in 1977 and 1978 respectively. Finally, he secured Turner's iconic Staffa, Fingal's Cave, which we've just seen, in December 1978, a painting that derives special significance from its status as the first ever major Turner work to have entered an American collection, having been bought by James Lennox, a collector from New York, in 1845. Taken together then, this concise but exemplary body of paintings is representative of every major phase of Turner's career. But Mellon's collecting of Turner extended beyond the artist's oils. He also bought an extraordinary range of works in other media, including many extremely fine watercolours by the artist. Numbering over 100 individual pieces, including highly finished drawings and on-the-spot sketches, it again represents the full range of Turner's career. Just a few highlights, all of which you can see in the exhibition, include the wonderful early watercolour study, A Great Tree, from circa 1794, Turner's show-stopping Vesuvius in Eruption from 1818, and his magical Venice, the Mouth of the Grand Canal, from circa 1840. Remarkably also, Mellon succeeded in building an unrivaled collection of prints by or after Turner. The YCBA holds 3,000 such works, and here's just a small selection. This is largely through his having acquired a substantial portion of one of the most important Turner print collections in the world, that belonging to W.G. Rawlinson, an art historian active in the late 19th and early 20th centuries who dedicated his career to studying and collecting Turner's work, particularly the artist's engravings. Thanks to this major acquisition, the collection boasts many unique early experimental or proof impressions that document the process of producing the engravings. And last but not least is, of course, Turner's Channel sketchbook, owned by the artist and critic John Ruskin. When Ruskin inventoried Turner's works as part of the artist's bequest to the British nation in the mid-1850s, he described it as Turner's last sketchbook in colours. Mellon purchased it for the YCBA in 1986 on the recommendation of the museum's then director, Duncan Robinson. As you can see, it's in a remarkable state of preservation, its colours retaining much of their original brightness and intensity. The result is that YCBA's collection is the single most complete and representative group of Turner's works outside of the UK. As such, it provides a kind of cross-section through the artist's work, almost like a slide prepared for the microscope. One of my key ambitions in this exhibition was to capitalise on the potential offered by YCBA's exceptional collection to show not just a series of superb masterpieces, but to trace the full arc of Turner's artistic development across his nearly 60-year career. It begins at the dawn of Turner's artistic activity. Turner began his artistic training early, and as was the convention for this time, his training was in a form of art characterized by meticulous technique and adherence to well-established thematic and aesthetic conventions. His earliest teacher, Thomas Moulton the Younger, was a leading architectural topographer. From him, Turner learned the accurate representation of architectural details, the use of geometry to construct convincing linear perspective, and a highly systematic approach to rendering form and colour. All of these traits are readily in evidence in the earliest examples of his finished watercolours in the YCBA's collection. In common with other topographical artists, Turner travelled extensively in search of suitable subjects for his brush. Initially, these tours focused on areas close to London. In the case of the watercolour shown here to the left, Turner only travelled as far as the neighbouring county of Kent, where he focused his efforts on recording the ancient cathedral city of Canterbury. His subject here is St Augustine's Gate, the 14th century principal entrance gateway between the city and the monastery that had been founded by St Augustine of Canterbury himself in the late 6th century. Turner made this study in 1793, just a few years after he began his formal training. As we might expect, it follows conventional topographical practice. The work's main focus is the medieval gateway and its picturesque appearance, which Turner intentionally emphasised through such details as the tangled foliage that covers part of its crumbling structure. Turner's approach to rendering architectural forms here is also highly characteristic of his early training. You can see that he employed dark outlines to delineate and give definition to the different parts of his composition. Every carved detail is meticulously rendered. He then infilled these with delicate washes to suggest tone and shadow. The result is that the image is executed with such minute precision that we can clearly make out every individual block of stone in the gateway, each separated by a sliver of blank paper to represent the mortar joins between them. The only human presence is the tiny figure in the foreground, who is shown carrying a heavy sack on his shoulders. Ultimately, though, he is little more than a foil to the buildings, serving to give the viewer a sense of their scale. Turner could no doubt have forged a very successful and satisfactory career producing imagery just like this, but even at this early stage of his career, we can see a degree of talent and a level of ambition that would not be satisfied by a narrow specialism in antiquarian topography. One aspect of this was that Turner sought to learn as much as he could from his contemporaries and predecessors, both within and beyond the topographical tradition. He was greatly aided in this by the support of a celebrated physician and amateur art collector, Dr. Thomas Munro. Munro's extensive collection included drawings by some of the most eminent watercolourists of the time. He enjoyed the company of young artists and commissioned a number of them to copy works from his collection. Turner was one of the beneficiaries of Munro's support, and it enabled him to gain an intimate familiarity with a far more expressive and evocative artistic approach than the elegant precision favoured by his teacher, Thomas Moulton. The dramatic view that I've illustrated to the right of my slide, with its striking vantage point looking towards the town of Tivoli in central Italy, encapsulates this formative experience. Turner made this in the mid-1790s, before he'd ever travelled to Italy. This means we can be sure that it is an entirely derivative work. Indeed, it is almost certainly an exact copy based on an earlier watercolour by John Robert Cousins, perhaps the most accomplished member of the previous generation of landscape watercolourists. As in Turner's earlier topographical drawings, an ancient building is one of the key subjects of the work. in this case, the ancient Roman Temple of Vesta, also known as the Temple of the Sibyl, the circular building seen to the upper right. But rather than forming a central motif of the image, it soars dramatically over the seething falls below. The landscape, rather than the building, has become the subject of the work. And rather than every detail being rendered with minute care, the basic image is formed from large areas of carefully graduated colour wash that endow the image with a strong sense of unity and drama. In spite of its small scale, these were lessons that Turner would go on to apply in his own independent works from the later 1790s onwards. We see this clearly in Turner's view of Harlech Castle, exhibited in 1799. Harlech Castle was one of the strongholds constructed after King Edward I's conquest of Wales. A classic antiquarian subject, we would expect a topographically trained artist like Turner to make it the dominant feature of his image. By contrast, however, he has pushed it back into the distance so that it becomes a striking but subsidiary element in an evocatively atmospheric, wider landscape composition. Even more remarkable, however, is the scene of modern industry in the form of a shipbuilder's yard to the right. Its assertively contemporary forms heighten the castle's appearance of antiquity. Similarly, the sense of constructive activity created by the thicket of masts and the precariously balanced hull of the ship complicates the otherwise meditative calm of the image. Antiquarian topography has been transformed into a poetic language of layered meanings. Turner was no less concerned to engage with and learn from the wider continental tradition. While continuing to draw on the work of earlier British artists, he also looked to the example provided by his great continental predecessors. His first exhibited oil at the Royal Academy, for instance, was a moonlit maritime scene that combined the influences of Joseph Wright of Derby and Philip Jack de Lauterbourg, as well as the celebrated Dutch master Rembrandt van Rijn. However, it was the paintings of the 17th century French landscapist Claude Lorraine that made the deepest impression on Turner. One in particular, Turner's revered seaport with the embarkation of the Queen of Sheba from 1648, reportedly brought Turner to tears when he saw it. He lamented that he would never be able to paint anything like it. Claude remained a touchstone for the rest of Turner's life, inspiring a pattern of conscious emulation that is overtly expressed in works like Lake Avernus, which you can see here to the left, from 1815. Turner's canvas dramatizes an episode from ancient Roman mythology when the Cumanian Sibyl, a kind of priestess, prepares to lead the mythical hero Aeneas through the lake to see his dead father. Lake Avernus, the water-filled mouth of an extinct volcano, was believed by ancient Romans to be the entrance to the underworld. The affinities between Turner's painting and Claude's pastoral landscape from 1648, which you can also see in the exhibition, are striking. Turner employed the same sweeping lines to delineate the trees that frame his composition, while the effect of seemingly infinite recession that he so skillfully achieves, and which is heightened by his choice of a similarly warm colour palette, also testifies to the extent that he sought to emulate Claude's example. But Turner was no mere imitator. His brilliant exploitation and development of the artistic techniques pioneered by his predecessors reflects a young artist who was both rooted in tradition but also highly ambitious. This is nowhere seen more clearly than in the works he produced following his first continental tour of 1802. Turner's willingness to brave the dangers and deprivations of continental travel in an age before planes, trains, and automobiles itself signals how far his sights were now extending beyond the horizons of British antiquarian topography. Indeed, he might well have set off for the continent earlier had travel not been made impossible by the French Revolution and wars that followed. Certainly, he seized the opportunity presented by a brief period of peace following the signing of the Treaty of Amiens to cross the English Channel. The goal of Turner's expedition through France and Switzerland was the dramatic landscapes of the Alps, which he reached in August 1802. Throughout his journey, he sketched constantly, generating a huge body of drawings that he used as the basis for many finished works, including this spectacular watercolour of Mer de Glace, completed some 10 or more years after his visit. It's a true tour de force of painterly accomplishment. In its scale alone, it is on another level to the watercolours we've just seen. Measuring over 2 by 3.5 feet, it is over twice the size of either St Augustine's Gate or Tivoli. Turner was clearly capitalising on the rise in popularity of watercolours in the first years of the 19th century, when artists began using the medium for large-scale exhibition pieces in a bid to show that it was more than a mere tool for instruction. But it is also Turner's innovative treatment of his subject in this image that is worthy of notice. By arranging the composition on a sharp diagonal, Turner makes us feel as though we are standing at the valley's very edge, wrapped with awe and terror as we comprehend nature's magnitude and the precipitous mountainous landscape that surrounds us. Carefully judged exaggerations of form and line further intensify the image's emotional effect, as seen in the sinuous trunks of the blasted pines that grow on the craggy rocks. Just as extraordinary is his handling of materials. An array of different brush, paint, pen, and scraper effects create remarkably realistic renditions of natural textures and patterns. The image leaves us with little doubt that in the years following his first continental trip, Turner's level of ambition quickly grew to exceed the bounds of conventional artistic practice. The themes of Turner's emulation and his determination to continually push at the limits of his artistic capabilities come out clearly in Dort. One of the great masterpieces in YCBA's collection, it's a brilliant demonstration of Turner's quest to outdo the most celebrated of his Dutch predecessors. Its composition is a self-conscious reworking of Albert Cuyp's famed The Mars at Dordrecht from 1650. And I put the two images, just say quickly, on the slide together. It's interesting, when I was thinking about, in the early stages of conceiving this exhibition, whether it might be a possibility or even a sort of a thing of interest to bring in the Cuyp image and to bring it here and display it alongside Turner's Dort. And in the end, I decided not to do it, but I thought that the lecture tonight would be a great opportunity to just show the paintings together, so you can hopefully see what I mean with what I'm going to say next. However, on close looking, it soon becomes clear that Turner's aim was to surpass the earlier painting in both technical accomplishment and striking visual effect. More than simply recreating the diffuse, golden quality of light in Cuyp's image, Turner introduced a richness of colouring that endows his painting with even greater luminosity. This in large part is thanks to his liberal use of yellow pigments, in particular the recently developed intense pigment chrome yellow. Exploiting the narrative potential of the scene, Turner also filled his canvas with incident, seemingly basing some of the details on scenes he'd witnessed when he passed through the busy port during his second continental tour of 1817. In contrast to the rather polite portrayal of the boat and its passengers in Cuyp's image, the ferry boat in Turner's work is teeming with life. Its deck overflows with passengers who strain to look overboard as supplies from the passing vessels are being unloaded. The result is that the landscape, seeming calm and tranquility, becomes a setting for something much more richly human. Immediate and accessible, this scene within a scene bridges the gap between the viewer and the romanticized landscape, drawing us visually and emotionally into the heart of the image. Turner's growing ambitions, moreover, drove him to embrace an exceptionally wide range of media. An important facet of this was his sustained and unusually direct involvement in the field of printmaking. The use of a reproductive medium offered the artist the potential to build both his wider reputation and to increase his income. His reputational concerns are nowhere clearer than in the Liber Studiorum, a series of engravings after Turner's designs that the artist supervised and published himself. Although never completely finished, it ranks among Turner's most ambitious projects, comprising 70 individual prints in etching and mezzotint of an array of landscape and seascape compositions. Once again, this endeavour manifests his admiration for and rivalry with Claude. His direct inspiration was Claude's celebrated Liber Veritatis, or Book of Truth. This consisted of sepia ink and wash drawings that Claude made to record his authentic compositions. A century later, they were reproduced by the British engraver Richard Earlham as fine mezzotints. This magnificent publication reinforced the Liber Veritatis' reputation as the epitome of the art of landscape. While imitating the format and sepia colouring of Claude's drawings, Turner's plates had entirely different aims. Rather than being records of his paintings, they were illustrations of his own original theory of landscape art. According to Turner, all landscapes can be grouped into 6 fundamental categories: architectural, historical, marine, mountainous, pastoral, and elevated pastoral. As you can see from the example to the left here, Turner added letters to the top of each print to indicate which of these categories his image belongs to. I don't know if you can hopefully make that out at the top of the engraving to the left of the slide. However, Turner's most personal and experimental use of the print medium is found in his so-called Little Liber works. These were mezzotints that Turner engraved himself and which he used to explore different atmospheric effects. Mezzotint as a printmaking technique offered a broad tonal range, from deep blacks to bright white highlights, which Turner fully exploited, as we see in his rendering of the Evening Gun to the right. The result was some of the most expressive landscape prints ever made. Turner's determination to utilize the potential of the print medium is evident even in the more conventional reproductive engravings that were produced after his paintings. Always mindful of the specific requirements of the medium, he was prepared to manipulate tone, line, and detail to increase the impact of a finished print, even if it meant supervising the specialist reproductive engravers who worked on these to the utmost degree. The touched proof or trial print that we see here is a good example of this. Covered with Turner's extensive handwritten notes, basically his instructions to the engraver, it highlights his almost obsessive attention to detail, as well as his minute, indeed perhaps rather overbearing, supervision of his engraver's work. So I just quickly show you one of the points, and I think this is actually quoted in the exhibition. If you can see the detail to the left, one of the instructions that Turner gives to his engraver is to add a bird's nest with eggs. You can see that he's circled that and he's got an arrow pointing to it. Turner's meticulous attention to developing his prints proved highly successful, and he had highly lucrative relationships with many print publishers of his day. Indeed, many of his small watercolors were produced specifically as models for major print series. Turner then reveals himself to have been very much a modern man of business. He was both part of and continually responding to the demands of a growing marketplace for consumer goods, fueled by Britain's burgeoning imperial and industrial economy. These themes were directly expressed in his art. In painting HMS Victory, the site of Admiral Lord Nelson's most decisive triumph over Napoleonic France, the Battle of Trafalgar, and also the scene of his death, Turner wasn't just demonstrating his skill in rendering a maritime subject, he was evoking a heroic narrative calculated to appeal to the patriotic fervour of the British public. That he simultaneously portrayed the ship from 3 points of view and against a semi-fictive backdrop suggests that he intended his painting to be regarded as an idealised portrait of the Royal Navy's most famous warship too. Turner's enthusiastic engagement with modern industry is clearly in evidence in his panoramic view of Leeds, a town in the northern English county of Yorkshire that was also a major centre of manufacturing during the Industrial Revolution. Turner shows the full panoply of its bustling industrial activity in his watercolour. Textile workers hang out newly woven and washed cloth to dry. Masons mend a wall. A milk boy and his pony return from their daily delivery. Behind them, smoke from new factories and houses mingles with the morning mist, surrounding but not entirely subordinating the town's churches. Turner's fascination with modern technology continued for the rest of his life, but in very different and increasingly complex contexts. In this late watercolour, Turner depicts a paddle steamer caught in the midst of a storm on Lake Lucerne. The faint vertical brushstrokes, punctuated by blue-black rain clouds, evoke the downpour, while a figurative and literal gash in the surface of the paper suggests a lightning flash. Rather than prompting us to see the steamboat as a straightforward symbol of human ingenuity, Turner instead emphasises its vulnerability as it heads into the dark waters, the black smoke from its funnel drifting tentatively skywards. The unequal relationship between human ambition and the overwhelming power of nature becomes an increasingly strong theme in Turner's works from the 1840s. In these later images, the natural world is shown at its most turbulent and at its most elegiac. Nowhere is this clearer than in his late depictions of the sea and sky. In Stormy Sea Breaking on a Shore, Turner uses rapid gestural brushstrokes and a limited colour palette to convey the dizzying intensity of the sea and wind. Crashing waves scatter across the middle ground of the image, while light breaks through in a way that hints at the sharp breeze driving the clouds apart. In so many ways, then, the exhibition, made possible through the extraordinary richness of YCBA's holdings, allows us to see the Turner of legend, as well as to trace the artist's evolution over a long career. At the same time, the exhibition reveals with exceptional clarity how the stereotype of Turner as the first truly modern artist obscures a much more complex reality. It allows us to see with new clarity that Turner was in many ways a deeply contradictory figure, someone who, when we look at him today, constantly embodies tensions between apparently opposing characteristics. He was at once an artistic rebel and a fervent upholder of tradition and its institutions, the pioneer of a new painterly style who seems, on close examination, to display remarkable consistency of aims and methods, an idealist who was also a shrewd, highly acquisitive businessman, a progressive who was also a profound pessimist, and a patriot who extolled Britain's growing imperial and industrial power while remaining convinced of the ultimate futility of all worldly hopes. While the exhibition's title, J.M.W. Turner, Romance and Reality, relates to perhaps the greatest polarity in Turner's life and work, it is also about uncovering the reality behind the romanticised image of the artist. So this leads me to the third and final part of my talk, where I'd like to go beyond the specific themes of the exhibition and say a bit more about how they've made me pay attention to certain features of Turner's works. In particular, I'd like to share with you my increasing conviction that the apparent contradictions, the tensions between polarities that are writ large in his life and career, can also be seen in the way that he constructs individual images. More specifically, I would like to suggest that it manifests itself in an unusually extensive and skillful use of various kinds of contrast. Let's look in more detail at some works in the exhibition to see if I can make clearer what I'm trying to get at. Out of all the works in the show, Wreckers perhaps best exemplifies the myriad ways that Turner made use of contrast to enhance the impact of his images. The painting, exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1834, is notable for its broad handling and dramatic mood. You can see quite clearly how it already foreshadows the extreme painterliness of the turbulent, daringly generalised seascapes of Turner's late career. But when we start to look closely, it soon becomes apparent that the painting is more than a stepping stone on the pathway to greater abstraction. The composition makes use of a whole series of oppositions, thematic, formal, atmospheric, and coloristic, that reveals the complexity of Turner's vision of the world. To begin with, the painting has an intriguing double narrative. One is about rescue. Turner shows a steamer, which we can see to the right, rushing to the aid of a ship that, overcome by a storm, flounders off the wild coast of Northumberland in northeast England. So on the one hand, the painting speaks to the human capacity for goodness and our willingness to help others in the face of considerable danger or adversity. At the same time, however, Turner shows us that things are not quite so simple. While this selfless act takes place in the background, the foreground is dominated by a far less altruistic activity. Here we see the wreckers of the painting's title, the men and perhaps women who gather on the shore in the hope of scavenging the cargo lost by the sinking vessel. The force with which they tug at their ropes and nets, creating a dynamic formal tension within the image that contrasts with the near vertical sweep of the waves, is suggestive of their determination to take whatever advantage they can of the misfortune of others. Through this pattern of opposed intentions, Turner seems to be telling us how interdependent loss and gain and destruction and survival truly are. Meanwhile, Turner underscores the opposition between human vulnerability and steadfastness in his inclusion of the ruins of Dunstable Castle in the far distance. Though reminiscent of the antiquarian topography that had so deeply shaped his early work, here the gaunt though enduring forms of the 14th century fortification create a moving contrast with the storm-tossed ship and the otherwise fragile human lives around it. Turner's use of colour, moreover, continues and reinforces this pattern of oppositions. Here, warmer and brighter tones are set against cooler and darker colours in a way that literally divides his image into two distinct zones. To the left, warm brown ochre and pinkish tones define the landward side of the image, while cooler blues and greys characterise the scene's storm clouds to the right. Upon this left-right opposition, Turner superimposes a further contrast and divides the image diagonally from upper right to lower left into darker and lighter areas. Even more ingeniously, the brightest and darkest parts of the image are in close proximity. The light of the sun pours over the shadow of the looming clouds and strikes the foreshore just above the dark forms of the wreckers and their plunder. In the castle, moreover, we see a similar pattern of contrast between the bleak, bold towers along the cliff's edge and the bright, slender tower that soars above them. Altogether, these layers of contrast imbue the image with the dramatic, dynamic qualities that make it so memorable. As with wreckers, the effect of Staffa builds on superimposed layers of narrative and visual contrast. The steamboat that crawls its way unsteadily towards the viewer is a symbol of human endeavour at the heart of a scene of palpable natural grandeur and remoteness. It is also a signifier of modernity that forms a further symbolic contrast with the ancient mythological associations of Fingal's cave. The physical forms depicted are also defined by a similarly powerful use of contrast, the towering solidity of the basalt cliffs being juxtaposed against the dizzying swell of the sea. Meanwhile, the slender funnel and masts of the steamer uncannily echo the angle of the cliff face, as if to heighten the implication of human frailty in the face of natural power. And as we have come to expect, with Turner, the pictorial effect is strengthened further by the way light and colour are handled. Again, he makes use of sharply contrasting elements, while to the left, the parting storm clouds give way to reveal an area of more intense brightness. To the right, the dense blanket of angry clouds, punctuated only by the glowing orange disk of the emerging sun, creates an area of more uniform darkness. Even more than in wreckers, the effect is that of a kind of checkerboard of light and dark, warm and cool. And in the very texture of paint itself, we find Turner once again deploying his trademark combination of thin glazes in the sea and intensely worked impasto in the clouds and smoke. So once again, Turner's image sets up a series of polarities between the natural and artificial, the ancient and modern, light and dark, storm and calm, sea and land, towering solidity and ethereal delicacy, and the opaque and translucent. And it is done so skillfully that we accept it, even though it borders, indeed surely moves beyond, the realms of physical possibility. I will briefly touch on one last, perhaps less obvious, example. At first sight, the third great Turner masterpiece from Mellon's collection, Invery Pier, appears to be a much more unambiguous image. All extraneous detail has been subordinated to a unified overall effect, so that sky, water, and land meld together as transient, luminous presences. Such seemingly incomplete forms blur the borderlines between the finished and unfinished, the abstract and the representational. But as we look more carefully, we see many of the same contrastive devices, less overtly, but perhaps even more consistently expressed. Yet again, the painting employs a combination of warm and cool colours, which are split between the two halves of the composition. While warm tones dominate to the left, they are balanced to the right by predominance of cooler tones. Here, this helps create a sense of the shifting quality of light, as well as helping to locate us as viewers on the shoreline of the loch, with the calm expanse of water on the left washing up against the land on the right. This effect is again reinforced by a combination of thin washes and transparent glazes of colour with thicker impasto. So loosely applied are the washes in the middle ground of the composition that they form a kind of delicate fringe of drips. And in turn, these form part of a wider set of contrasts between isolated patches of fine detail, in this case, rendering the trunks of distant trees that form carefully defined foci for the eye. So even Invery Pier, on closer examination, turns out to be in its own way as carefully structured around finely calculated contrasts as more overtly dramatic works like Wrecker's and Staffa. This consistent and highly skillful use of contrast, it seems to me, are important contributors, at least in part, to the enduring aesthetic and emotional power of Turner's imagery. That is not to say, of course, that contrasts of varying kinds haven't been used by many other artists before and since. Indeed, in British art, it was Hogarth who pioneered the use of psychological and moral contrast to striking effect in his print pendants and series like Beer Street and Gin Lane, or Industry and Idleness. However, it seems to me that Turner's use of contrast is distinctive in the way that it seems to assert both sides of a contrast without giving priority to one or the other. It is this quality, I wish to suggest, that gives his best works an intensity and sense of reality that distinguishes him from most other artists before or since. I'd like to conclude my talk today by considering how this enables us to rethink some aspects of Turner's traditional reputation. He is modern in the sense that Isaiah Berlin traced in his studies of Romanticism, the abandonment of the classical Platonic assumption that somewhere out there is a single harmonious reality in which all contradictions are resolved. Instead, we are forced to confront a world where contradiction and tensions and the resulting potential for both joy and exhilaration and pain and loss are fundamental and inextricably interdependent aspects of reality. It is a lesson that we intuit in front of these stupendous canvases without it ever quite being made overt. And yet it is a lesson that we are more in need of than ever in this age of growing and ever more intractable polarization of morality, politics, and belief. Turner helps us to recognize that we need to find a way to live in a world that is, in its most fundamental nature, complex, confusing, and painful. And the way we can do this is by finding within it depth of beauty and a richness of possibility that the utopias and Arcadias of our imaginations could never rival. So I hope you'll join me in wishing Joseph my Lord William Turner a very happy 250th birthday. Thank you. So I think we have time for some questions if anybody has any burning thoughts or questions they would like to share. Oh, yes.
Just a quick question on the Turners that we see now. Are they the same as he would have seen them in the first half of the 19th century? Or have the colors shifted? In other words, are we looking at the values and tones that he wanted to express, or has time sort of taken its toll on the pigments used?
Yeah, that's a great image. Thank you. Sorry, great question. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think certainly in the case of those wonderful watercolors, you know, a lot fading has happened to them. And obviously, you know, watercolor is such a kind of fugitive medium. And, you know, our Turners are always in high demand. So I would say that for sure, you know, that there is a degree of fading. I think actually, and I did mention this in my talk, that the sketchbook is in a wonderful state of preservation. So we're very lucky with that. Turner, interestingly, was a great experimenter, you know, with his materials. And actually, I didn't have too much time to go into that in the lecture. But even with oil paints, you know, he was kind of mixing different forms of pigments and so forth. And so actually, things, you know, some of the colours in his canvases were, you know, have been fugitive too. So I think that, you know, we see a lot of what his audiences would have seen, but I think, you know, even with the oils, there's, you know, potentially a degree of fading. I should say though, and this is a shout out to my conservation colleagues, that especially in preparation for the exhibition, two of the major Turners in our collection were cleaned. So, you know, that has certainly brought them up to a, you know, wonderful standard. So, you know, I'm very pleased that Jessica and Mark, my close colleagues, were able to undertake that treatment. But it's a great question. Thank you. Question over here.
He had a very interesting life, and I'm just curious when I read the history. What took place that resulted in him being interred in St. Paul's Cathedral?
So I think that's a really interesting question too. I think that Turner's biography is incredibly complex. And I think many people who have perhaps read about his life will know that for kind of a long, long time, he was planning how he would leave a legacy to the nation. And I think this was, you know, part of his plan that he was able to be interred in St. Paul's Cathedral, which is obviously you know, a place for very eminent figures. Many of you in the audience will know that Turner's bequest to the British nation was made, you know, he made that after his death in 1851, and then, you know, famously John Ruskin inventoried that collection, and then it went to the National Gallery and then found its way to Tate Britain. And so Turner planned this for a long, long time. And I think that what I hope to bring across in my talk, that, you know, we have this artist who was kind of hugely ambitious. He was thinking about his reputation all the time, and that wasn't just his reputation in his own lifetime, but how it would extend, you know, beyond that. And so, you know, he planned much of this. And actually, it's interesting when we think about his will, because famously, you know, it was contested by many of his close family members, and wrangles over it went on for a long, long time. You know, the fact that he'd cut many of them out and was bequeathing, you know, his collection to the nation.
Thank you very much.
It for questions.
Hi.
Oh, question at the back.
Hi. So my original question was similar to the question about the colors. I noticed that in the negative spaces, there's so much going on color-wise, and there's so many small, you know, when you get close, so many small layered strokes of different colors. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the experimental side of it, or what are the different mediums that are being used?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So, I mentioned that Turner used his materials in a very experimental way. So again, quite famously, he tended to kind of use oils almost in the manner of watercolors. So, when we think about watercolors, they are, they're a translucent medium. They enable painters to paint in a very kind of loose way. And so he watered down, particularly from the second half of his career, he tended to water down his oils to create much thinner glazes that he could then manipulate with a greater kind of degree of flexibility. And interestingly, he then used his watercolors often in the opposite way. So thickening them to then, create a much more opaque kind of layer that he could then, work into as well. So he had this really interesting way of handling his materials. He also would use the end of his paintbrush to kind of scrape through the surface of of the paint, and that could be in both watercolor. He did it in oils and actually even in prints when he was producing the mezzotints that I showed earlier. So it was a very kind of flexible, he's really kind of pushing his materials to their limits often. But it's this kind of interesting, and I think, it's kind of very distinctive to Turner's practice that he had this kind of ability to use oils or to manipulate them in a way that you would, expect an artist to be working in the watercolor medium. So it's an interesting kind of crossover.
I just was wondering, does that mean that the watercolors and the oils were used in the same paintings? Okay.
No. So
Super.
I just mean in the way that he was handling each of them in the separate works. And you see this, particularly so in Repair, the painting that I showed at the very end, that's a great sort of example because it's just these really sort of watered down, thin glazes. And I, mentioned the sort of drips. And if you look closely at that canvas, you can just see, how loosely the paint is applied. And how extraordinarily innovative that is for the time, bearing in mind that painting was, painted in 1845. So, it's kind of extraordinary that he could manipulate, his media in that way.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just interested in how he actually went about painting. Did he really paint in directly on a prima, or did he tend to paint in layers? What was the process that he favored?
I think Turner was a very kind of spontaneous draftsman. So, I mean, I mentioned again, he would take he would make copious drawings. So recording almost obsessively all the time. Often those drawings were kind of notational. So it's interesting, just thinking about Dort, which is, an incredibly detailed painting, and sketches that he made of that, which actually survive in Tate Britain's collection, are, extraordinarily economic in the way that, they sort of record his observations. So he had this extraordinary capacity to work in he must have had an extraordinary memory, but also, this capacity to work in a way with his imagination that he was able to kind of relive the experiences and then, reconceive them on or in his canvases or watercolors. And I think that, again, he kind of was able to kind of, manipulate the paints, his, again, adding pigments, painting in layers. In his studio, he often kept multiple canvases. So we know that, he would often work on multiple paintings at one time. He might leave works for a period of time and then return to them. And we think actually in the case of In Repair, that may have been the case where, the painting was set aside for a long time. So there's this sort of, I guess, your question about the layers. Yes, he did. And I think you can see that changes over time, that, when we're getting to the much later works, there's definitely a sense of him working in these multiple, quite delicately applied paint layers. And I think that's, it's different to his earlier works. But he was definitely a spontaneous draftsman. And, famous scene, if anyone has seen the Mr. Turner film, where on varnishing day, the artists would have their works hung on the wall, and then famously Turner, walked into the exhibition space with a paintbrush, dab of red, that's all he needed to do. He stood back, everyone was just like, oh, wow, he's really transformed that image. So, there's these little touches. I don't know if that answers your question. And I think, the way in which he worked, was really quite free form, even though he was making these copious sketches, which were the basis for, watercolors and oils. I think his extraordinary inventiveness and the way that he could experiment just meant that, he was very much caught in the moment with these works, if that makes sense. Oh, the question here. Sorry.
Was Turner the first impressionist?
I hope that in what I've said that, we in my talk today, that, in a way, for sure, that, Turner in many ways is the precursor to this kind of painting, but also his work is, far, it's more complex than that. There's these very sort of complex layers of meaning, symbolic and formal, etc., etc. And so it's a kind of an idea of Turner that I think that we should move beyond for all the reasons I said.
Just wanted to ask, when you say, oh, I don't want the mic. No. When you say that the oil is watered down, what do you using as the catalyst for that?
So there was, and actually I've been looking at Jessica here. Jessica, can you help answer that? So the various gums and
So I think, as far as I know, the only paint that we've analyzed at Yale, it would be a traditional drying oil like linseed oil.
Yeah.
So maybe watered down isn't quite so apropos as like thinned with a thinner, like a an alcohol or something that could just make the paint leaner to permit glazes, as well as any other kind of other oils or additives that could help mitigate its stickiness or fluidity.
Yeah. Tim.
Hi, thank you. That was an absolutely brilliant lecture. It's so difficult to sum up Turner, and you've done it. But I wanted to ask you to reflect on your own response to Turner. You spent 2 years with this guy, and do you see a different Turner now from the one you started with, and has the Yale collection given you a different Turner from the ones that you might have known from collections in the UK?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Tim. Thank you. Yeah, I think so. Because in fact, it's the very question that the gentleman asked us to, a moment ago about, well, isn't Turner the first impressionist? It's that kind of very this idea of Turner being an innovator, but I think it's that complexity, and I think what I think it's thinking about not just the art, but him as a person and how that plays so much into the work. And I think also I hadn't really realized how much of his vision of the world it just encompasses so much. He's a romantic artist, but he moves way beyond that, at the same time as well. And I think that, and I still feel that you've been very kind, Tim, to say that the lecture summed up Turner, but I feel that even after 2 years, I'm sure if Ian is listening, he would say the same thing after a lifetime's, study of Turner's work, that it still feels impossible to nail the man down. It's just the images just constantly change, and I think the idea of contrast, which seems so obvious, it's so bleeding obvious when you look at the works, and yet it struck me actually quite late in the day, and really upon seeing the works hung on the walls, and then I thought, hang on a minute, actually you can start to see what he's doing here, which I hadn't actually noticed or hadn't realised quite the extent to which you get this, building of oppositions, and it becomes such a striking feature. But thank you, that's such a good question.
The different voices within Turner's work from a historical.
Oh, so what can you elaborate a little bit? Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So I think that sort of shift, that you see broadly taking place, and I think actually the collection, when it's hung on the walls, shows that so clearly. To me, and some people might disagree with this, but in a way, to me, it seems to kind of be part and parcel of Turner's drive to constantly be sort of trying to understand some kind of deeper truth about the world. That it's making him go beyond just mere representation. And in a sense, this is sort of what I meant about where, Turner is a sort of great contradictory figure, because even though the works move towards a kind of abstraction, they're still essentially rooted in the representational. But I think as forms start to kind of meld and blend, and we do see that sort of where kind of abstraction starts to kind of become more important, if we can kind of call it that. I do somehow think it's something fundamental about the way that Turner's starting to really engage. And to me, this is what sort of sets him apart from contemporaries like Constable. That his drive just goes far deeper, if that makes sense. And I think it's just this need that he has, and I feel that somehow this is where his work takes on a sort of tragic aspect, that he never quite feels that he gets to that point. I think it's just constant striving that he feels he never quite succeeds. And yet I think we look at the work today, as 21st century viewers, and I think he does succeed. Of course he does, because they say everything. And I hope that I brought some of that out towards the end of my lecture, that so profoundly he sums up a world that so many other artists just they don't do, or they fail to see it. I hope that answers your question.
Lucinda, I think we have one more here.
Perfect. Hello, Annabelle.
Hello. Having spent so much time with Turner, and I'm thinking your references to Constable and the Impressionists, if you could put Turner next to one artist, any artist, in sort of a curator's utopia, who might that artist tentatively be?
That's the hardest question. I don't know. I don't think I can. I think it's so. It's almost become a cliche to say that Turner is a pioneering genius. But I honestly cannot answer your question. There is no one I feel, to me, and I love so many different artists, and I wouldn't list them all, we'll be here for 3 hours. But to me, there's nobody that I've encountered. I mean, no artist who can sum up the world. And even considering, the wonderful artists working today, that we've got Tracy Emin, amazing show upstairs. But I think he is the single most person I would think of that can so, that is able to sort of encapsulate this vision of the world, which to me no other artist does. So sorry, I haven't answered your question. It's very difficult. Another question.
Hi, hang on, I'm coming.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Years ago, I went to the Tate Britain where they have the Turner painting where Hannibal crosses the Alps with all his elephants. I mean, that painting, the emotions that come up in the imagination, that he is thousands of meters up with, painting the elephants. Do you know the painting I'm talking
Yes,
about?
yeah.
I mean, it's just so incredible,
Yeah.
that all those elephants would cross the Alps, only to die in the Po Delta after the Hannibal had come down.
Mhm.
To me, it's just, I was much younger when I saw it. It's just, how could that be done? I was climbing, in the Mont Blanc, and he was up there and painting that,
Yeah,
When you talk about the imagination.
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really nice point because again, it just shows the vast range of of Turner's output and his capabilities that he can go from one thing to another so seamlessly, and obviously we tell his story on the walls and it just seems like this shift is taking place. And of course, we're not seeing the trouble and strife he may have gone through as an artist, but exactly right that it's this extraordinary
It's just incredible.
diversity. Yeah. One more question, yeah.
The other question about if you could take two artists and put them together, we have had a rather interesting experience in the last 7 days because Turner's always been my favorite artist. We went into the Met and saw Caspar David Friedrich's exhibition, and the two of them speak to each other in some really interesting ways, very different, and I would be fascinated to know what, if anything, was learned from the one from the other. But I wonder, have you seen that exhibit?
Do you know, I haven't yet managed to make it over just because, obviously you will know that we reopened so recently and it's been a very, very, very busy time. But it is my intention to go see it. I'm familiar with some of the works in the Met's show. And it's interesting what you say, because of course there are so many crossovers between Turner and Friedrich, but I also see so many differences between them. We could kind of list them all, but I think it's interesting that there's a sense of real sort of religiosity, in Friedrich's work that somehow, it's not there in Turner's. Turner's work has a different kind of spirituality. Because when I look at his works, I feel that they embody some form of spirituality, but it's very, very different. And I think Turner's version of the world is this all kind of all-encompassing view that as I was saying, it's sort of seeking some deeper truth, whereas to me Friedrich is far more surface, if that makes sense. What he's people may disagree with this, but it seems more superficial compared to Turner's deep striving to kind of understand the fundamental workings of the universe. And I don't know if that's too big a thing to say, but that's my own kind of personal impression. And while I think Friedrich's work is amazing, I somehow don't quite feel I'm just thinking of something like Mer de Glace, that wonderful watercolor that I showed, which is on display in the exhibition, one of our great treasures. And you really feel like you're standing on the edge of the the valley side, looking down into that precipitous glacier. And I never quite get that feeling with Friedrich somehow, that he doesn't make me feel as part of an image as Turner does.